Let me tell you how a petty HOA rule turned my quiet suburban life into something straight out of a legal drama mixed with a home improvement show. It all started with Max, my over-energetic Labrador retriever with a nose for squirrels and a passion for escaping. We moved into our quiet cul-de-sac just under a year ago. The neighborhood was pleasant enough, trimmed hedges, polite waves, annual barbecues that were more about appearances than actual friendship. But to me, it was a fresh start, a place where Max could stretch his legs in a yard, and I could finally sip my morning coffee without the constant scream of city traffic. At first, Max and I got by with a few strategically placed lawn chairs, and a makeshift barrier using flower pots and garden gnomes to keep him from bolting. But one day, Max spotted a squirrel darting across the open lawn and without hesitation went full Olympic sprinter mode. He shot off like a rocket, nearly knocking over Mrs. Langford from next door, who was walking her tiny Maltese named Buttons. Buttons yelped, Mrs. Langford screamed, and Max, tongue lolling with joy, chased that squirrel right into the Thompson's rose bushes. I apologized profusely, wrangled Max back into our yard, and promised everyone I'd put up a proper fence. The neighborhood murmured in agreement. A fence made sense. Even Mr. Jenkins, the grumpy retiree who spent most of his time measuring the grass height of everyone's lawns, gave me a curt nod of approval. So, I started planning. I sketched out a modest wooden fence design, 4 feet high, slatted for airflow and visibility, cedar stain to match the earthy tones of our home. Nothing extravagant or overbearing, just a clean, responsible solution. I didn't think I'd need HOA approval. After all, half the homes on our street already had fences, albeit older, leaning, or haphazardly maintained ones. One even had plywood panels held together with duct tape. I figured mine would improve the visual standard, if anything. The following weekend, I began work. Post-hole digger in hand, I got to work under the spring sun while Max supervised from the porch, tail thumping enthusiastically. I got about 3 posts in before a shadow loomed across the lawn. I looked up, wiping sweat from my brow, and saw her, Mrs. Delaney, the HOA president. If you've never met a person who treats neighborhood policies like sacred texts, let me paint the picture. Mrs. Delaney always wore neatly pressed pastel blazers, even when walking her dog. Her voice had the tone of someone who once told a teacher they forgot to assign homework. She stood at the edge of my driveway, arms crossed, lips pursed as she stared at my half-buried fence posts like they were personally offensive. "Mr. Carter," she said, voice crisp, "I noticed you began a construction project without filing. A request for approval through the HOA. I stood up, brushing dirt off my jeans. "Hi, Mrs. Delaney. Yeah, just putting in a fence." I didn't think it would be an issue. Others have them, she sniffed. "Those fences are grandfathered in. The HOA updated its architectural guidelines 2 years ago. All new fencing requires prior approval and must align with community standards. Yours does not," I blinked. "Community standards? This is just a standard wooden fence. Clean, low, no barbed wire or anything." She raised an eyebrow. "Per subsection 14 of our residential enhancement guidelines, fences must be approved in design, material, and purpose. Furthermore, only specific fencing is permitted in visible front or side yards, and only after a landscaping integration plan is submitted." At that point, I couldn't decide whether to laugh or scream. I'd moved here to escape bureaucracy, not get tangled in it. "So, you're saying I need permission to keep my dog in my own yard?" "I'm saying," she replied with a smile. That didn't reach her eyes. "You need permission to alter the uniform aesthetic of our community." I sighed. "Okay, fine. What if I file the request now?" She pulled a clipboard from what seemed like nowhere and handed me a 4-page document. "Submit this along with your fence design, photos, a materials list, and a $75 application fee. The board meets once a month to review submissions. The next meeting is in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, Max could start a dog gang and establish turf lines." I thanked her stiffly, knowing full well that by the time approval rolled, around, if it did, my simple little fence project would become a bureaucratic minefield. Still, I tried. I filled out the forms, drew up the diagrams, included pictures of existing fences on the block for comparison, and even included a polite cover letter explaining Max's escape artistry. I dropped off the packet at the HOA office and waited. 2 weeks later, I got the denial letter. Your proposed fence does not align with the visual uniformity of the community and may impede views from adjacent properties. As such, your application is denied. Attached was a highlighted copy of the guidelines and a polite note suggesting alternative, fence-free containment solutions. I wasn't even angry at that point. I was stunned. Meanwhile, Max had become a neighborhood celebrity. People waved to him as he roamed the yard, often secured by a long leash. But he hated it. Every time he caught sight of a squirrel or passing dog, he lunged, tangled himself in knots, and barked like he'd been wronged by the entire animal kingdom. I appealed the decision. I sent a follow-up email with new sketches, suggesting I reduce the fence height. I offered to add shrubbery in front of it for visual blending. I even said I'd use materials that matched the siding of my house. No dice. Mrs. Delaney sent a brief reply. Per board decision, your fence remains unapproved. It wasn't just a matter of convenience anymore. It had become personal. I wasn't trying to build a fortress or throw off the balance of the neighborhood. I just wanted my dog to stay safe and keep to himself. But every polite request I made was answered with formality, red tape, and Mrs. Delaney's increasingly smug tone. So I did what any self-respecting, slightly stubborn homeowner would do. I stopped arguing. I stopped submitting forms. Instead, I started digging through city codes. If the HOA was going to throw the book at me, I figured I'd read the bigger book, the one they had to answer to. And somewhere in the middle of zoning regulations, permit requirements, and slope retention codes, I found something beautiful, something solid, a way around the fence rule. And a new idea started to form. Not just a solution for Max, but a statement. If they wouldn't let me build a fence, then I'd build something they couldn't touch. Not a fence, a wall. I'll be honest. When I first started digging through city code, I didn't think I'd actually find anything useful. I figured it would be hours of legalese, zoning restrictions, and terms like setback ordinances that would all boil down to the same message. The HOA has you boxed in. But then, like a golden needle in a bureaucratic haystack, I stumbled across a line that made me sit up straight. According to the city's municipal code, while fencing was subject to HOA oversight and required approval from the association, retaining walls were governed by the city itself. And get this, they could be up to 6 feet tall without needing permission from a homeowners association, provided they were constructed for purposes such as erosion control, soil retention, or safety due to grade elevation. That last part, grade elevation, was all I needed. I had a sloped yard. Nothing extreme, but enough to be interpreted as a minor elevation concern if you were motivated enough. And believe me, at this point, I was highly motivated. The moment I realized this wall loophole was real, something shifted in me. This wasn't just about Max or fencing anymore. It was about not being pushed around by people who thought they ran the world because they handed out violation notices and collected dues in pastel cardigans. I called up a friend from college, Mike, a civil engineer who now ran his own small firm that specialized in residential projects. After I explained the situation, he laughed for 5 minutes straight. "You want to build a retaining wall to get around the HOA? That's some next-level passive-aggressive genius," he said, still chuckling. "I'm serious," I told him. "Can we make it work?" Mike came over that weekend. He walked the perimeter of the yard, took measurements, and nodded thoughtfully. "You've got a slight grade toward the back. Nothing major. But if you adjust the landscaping and demonstrate soil retention needs, it's legit. The city won't care. As long as the permit is in order and it's safe, they're fine with it. Plus, it'll look good." We drew up the plans together. The wall would stretch along the same area where the original fence would have gone, only this time it would be made of concrete and stone, reinforced for safety. Mike designed a gentle curve to the structure that gave it a subtle elegance, and we decided on stacked stone veneer for a warm, rustic appearance. This wasn't going to be some bare slab of concrete, it would be beautiful. The next step was applying for the permit. I submitted all the engineering documentation, landscaping, layout, and the justification for elevation control. There wasn't a single word about dogs or HOA conflict, just erosion, runoff, and topsoil security. Bureaucrats love those words. I crossed my fingers and waited. 2 weeks later, the permit was approved. I had the city's blessing. I stood in my yard holding that stamped document and felt like I'd just won a small war. The first day construction began, I could practically feel Mrs. Delaney's blood pressure rising from 3 doors down. A small crew arrived in the morning, cement mixers, wheelbarrows, and enough stone to rebuild Rome. The workers began digging trenches and installing rebar supports. I didn't hide anything. This was no secret job. I wanted the HOA to see it. And sure enough, by lunchtime, I had company. Mrs. Delaney arrived in a brisk march, clipboard in hand, with the same expression someone might wear after finding a bug in their creme brulee. "What exactly is going on here?" she asked, peering past the workers like she expected to find a fence hiding behind them. "Building a retaining wall," I said, grinning. "For what purpose?" she asked, already flipping pages. "Erosion control. The slope in the yard creates runoff. Got a city permit and everything." I held it out like a get-out-of-jail-free card. She snatched it from my hand, scanning it like she might find a typo that would render it void. "This is absurd," she muttered. "You're exploiting a loophole." "No, I'm solving a problem. I'm keeping my yard safe and compliant. You should be proud. One less unsanctioned fence in the neighborhood." She glared at me, eyes narrowing. "You know this isn't in the spirit of the guidelines." "The guidelines don't apply to retaining walls," I replied, with more than a little satisfaction. "City says it's fine, and the city, as it turns out, outranks the HOA." She stared for a long moment, clearly deciding whether to argue, call a lawyer, or fake a heart attack. In the end, she walked away muttering something about legal counsel and setting a dangerous precedent. Construction continued. The crew worked fast. Within a week, the basic structure was in place. Smooth concrete footing, reinforced framing, and the beginnings of the stone facade. It already looked good, better than I'd imagined. Neighbors began slowing their walks to take a peek. Some asked what I was building. When I told them it was a retaining wall for erosion control, they'd glance at the near flat lawn and smirk knowingly. The whispers started spreading. Quiet admiration. From those who had quietly resented the HOA for years. I wasn't just building a wall anymore. I was building hope. Okay, maybe that's a stretch, but at the very least, I was giving the neighborhood something more interesting to talk about than what color shingles Mr. Harlan was installing or whether someone left their garbage cans out for too long. Mike stopped by regularly to inspect progress. We added details as we went, little touches that elevated it from functional to beautiful. Decorative lights along the top, climbing vines to soften the edges, even a shallow groove carved into the stone to serve as a channel for rainwater. It wasn't just a wall, it was an aesthetic choice, something that added value and style. Of course, the HOA wasn't done. I started getting letters, not about the wall itself, but about the temporary construction debris in my yard, the noise complaints, and a vague suggestion that the project might be creating unnecessary disruption to community serenity. I laughed each time and filed them neatly into my growing folder titled Petty HOA Nonsense. Mrs. Delaney even tried to bring the issue up at the next HOA meeting. I attended virtually, camera on, sipping a cup of tea with Max snoozing in the background. She tried to rally the board around the idea that while the wall was legal, it violated the intent of HOA harmony. She used phrases like precedent and integrity of the neighborhood. But there was nothing they could do. The city had the final say, and the wall was entirely above board. When someone on the board asked her, "Well, if it's legal and looks good, what exactly are we fighting here?" Her eye twitched visibly. That's when I knew I had won. What started as a way to keep Max in the yard had become a symbol of stubborn persistence and creative problem-solving. I hadn't just found a loophole. I'd turned it into a masterpiece. And better yet, I did it without ever breaking a single rule. They said I couldn't build a fence, so I built a wall instead, and it was glorious. The wall took about 3 weeks to complete, but even halfway through construction, it was already becoming the talk of the neighborhood. At first, people weren't sure what to make of it. A few neighbors assumed it was just another ambitious landscaping project. Some probably thought I was building an outdoor art installation. But as the stone facade began to take shape, smooth and elegant, with layers of textured veneer and a decorative lip running along the top edge, people started to realize this wasn't just some backyard eyesore. This was a statement. The wall stood 6 feet tall at its highest point, wrapping in a gentle arc along the rear and side borders of my yard. Mike and his crew didn't just build something functional, they built something beautiful. We added a few stone pillars at regular intervals, each topped with solar lanterns that lit up softly in the evening. I planted creeping vines along the base, the kind that would slowly grow to cascade over the surface in lush green folds. And just to really twist the knife, I installed a small fountain on the interior side, a gentle, bubbling feature that sent the sound of trickling water through the yard. Max loved it. Gone were the tangled leash days. Now he roamed the enclosed space freely, tail wagging and nose to the wind. He'd stretch out on the patio in the afternoons, basking in the sun like a dog who had just inherited a kingdom. Occasionally, he'd patrol the perimeter like he was on a mission, proud and alert, tail high and ears perked. It was his space now, and the wall gave him what the HOA wouldn't: freedom. What surprised me most was how quickly the mood of the neighborhood shifted. People who I'd barely exchanged more than a nod with started stopping by during walks. A man I'd never formally met, Paul from 4 houses down, paused during his evening jog one day to admire the craftsmanship. "You built this because of the fence thing, didn't you?" he asked, half smiling. I shrugged. "Let's just say it was inspired by community feedback," he laughed. "Genius. Honestly, it's the best-looking thing on the block. You might start a trend." And he wasn't wrong. Over the following week, I had at least half a dozen neighbors ask who had designed it, if it was HOA approved, and how they could do something similar. A retired couple even asked if I'd consider helping them reinterpret their landscaping. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Mrs. Delaney's silence was louder than any complaint. She walked past the property every morning, as she always had, her little white dog trotting dutifully by her side. But now she did it with a rigid back and a steely expression, glancing briefly at the wall like it was an unwanted monument. She didn't stop. She didn't say a word. But her disapproval radiated like heat off asphalt. 2 weeks after construction finished, I received a formal notice from the HOA. Not about the wall, because they knew better than to challenge it legally, but about unsightly landscaping debris and possible non-conforming architectural lighting. The irony was that the debris had been cleaned up days earlier, and the lighting was literally soft solar lanterns, dim enough that I'd seen people fall asleep under brighter porch lights. It was obvious retaliation. Petty little jabs meant to make me uncomfortable or maybe provoke a misstep. I didn't take the bait. I just documented everything, responded politely, and kept my own paper trail. Max continued to live his best life. The wall stood proud, and the neighborhood quietly began to side with me. Then came the HOA meeting. It was a monthly affair, usually ignored by most of the residents unless something major was on the docket. But this time, word had spread that Mrs. Delaney intended to address recent construction anomalies. The meeting took place over Zoom, a grid of bored-looking faces and awkward camera angles. I joined with a fresh cup of tea. Camera on, mic muted. Max curled up behind me like a furry reminder of why this all started. Mrs. Delaney launched into her statement with her usual self-important tone. She talked about the need for consistent aesthetics, about preserving the visual unity of the neighborhood, about the danger of precedents. Her voice was steady, but you could tell she was seething. She never said my name directly, but it was clear who she was referring to. "It is deeply concerning," she said, "that certain homeowners are interpreting legal technicalities to bypass the HOA's design authority. While such actions may not currently violate our guidelines explicitly, they undermine the collaborative nature of our community." A few board members nodded, but others looked uncomfortable. One of them, David, who lived 2 doors down and had always seemed like a reasonable guy, finally spoke up. "Let me just say," he began, "I've seen the wall in person. It's impressive. Honestly, it looks great. If more people built things that attractive, I don't think we'd have much to worry about." That earned a few surprised reactions, and Mrs. Delaney's eyes narrowed. "I agree," someone else said. "I thought it was going to be some kind of eyesore, but it actually improved the property." More nods followed. One person even said they were thinking of adding a retaining wall now. I could see the realization on Mrs. Delaney's face, that her grip on the neighborhood's design aesthetic was starting to slip, that the very rule book she had used to control everyone was now turning against her because someone had read it more carefully than she did. The meeting ended without any new resolutions or votes, just vague plans to review construction oversight in the future. But it was clear they had no real leverage left. The wall stayed. The city had approved it. It complied with every safety and construction guideline. There was nothing left to fight. I logged out of the meeting with a grin on my face. Over the next few days, I added the final touches. A wrought iron gate installed at the side entrance, complete with a decorative arch. A bench near the fountain, surrounded by lavender. And creeping time. The wall wasn't just a boundary anymore. It was a sanctuary, a piece of craftsmanship that had transformed my yard into something better than I ever imagined. And Max? He had become a legend. Neighbors referred to it as Max's Wall. Kids pointed it out from passing cars. Someone even took a photo and posted it to a local Facebook group with the caption, "When the HOA says no fence, so you go full Game of Thrones." I laughed so hard I cried. In the end, what began as a simple solution to keep my dog safe had turned into a neighborhood spectacle. It reminded people that just because a rule exists doesn't mean it's always right. Sometimes you have to dig deeper, ask better questions, and think bigger. The HOA tried to stop me from building a fence, so I built a masterpiece instead. About a month after the wall was finished, life settled into a new normal. The stone was cured, the landscaping had taken root, and the vines were starting to inch upward like they had found their calling. Max had become so used to his new kingdom that he now strutted around like a miniature mayor, greeting people who walked by and lounging like royalty beneath the lavender bushes. Every time I stepped into the yard, I couldn't help but smile. Not just because it was beautiful, but because it was mine. Built not in defiance, but in determination. A personal victory in gray stone and creeping green. One Saturday morning, I was sipping coffee on the back patio when I noticed something unusual. Mrs. Delaney was standing outside the wall, just beyond the property line. She wasn't walking her dog. She wasn't holding her clipboard. She was just standing there, looking at the wall like it had personally insulted her great-grandmother. I watched her for a few seconds, debating whether to call out or ignore her. In the end, curiosity got the better of me. "Morning," I said, keeping my tone light. She turned, startled, then stiffened. "Good morning," she replied, voice clipped. "Something I can help you with?" She hesitated. Her eyes flicked to the lanterns, the vines, the precise stonework. Then she finally said, "I suppose I owe you some acknowledgement." I raised an eyebrow. Acknowledgement? You've made your point, she said flatly. It's a nice wall, impractical, excessive, but nice. I didn't bother hiding my amusement. Thanks. Max seems to think so. Her eyes briefly drifted to Max, who was gnawing contentedly on a rubber bone in the shade, entirely unbothered by the tension in the air. She let out a soft sigh, and for the first time in all my interactions with her, she looked tired. You know, she said. When I joined the HOA board, I thought I was protecting the integrity of this neighborhood. I've lived here 20 years. I've seen what happens when people start bending the rules. The paint colors, the hedges, the junk cars parked in driveways. It starts small. I get that, I said, more sincerely than I expected. But maybe it's not about bending rules. Maybe it's about asking whether they still make sense. She gave a dry chuckle. Spoken like someone who just outsmarted the system. I didn't deny it. Instead, I walked closer to the wall and placed my hand on the smooth stone. This isn't just about getting around a no-fence policy. This was about doing something better. Safer for my dog, better for the yard, and honestly, better looking than any fence I would have built. She looked at me, and for a split second, her guard dropped. You know, some of the board members think we should update the bylaws. Include walls under the same restrictions as fences. Maybe, I said. But then you'd be punishing creativity and pushing people to take shortcuts. Not everyone will care enough to do things the right way if you box them in. There was a pause. The air was still, heavy with the unspoken truth that the war was over and the battlefield was now just a well-manicured lawn. Then she nodded once, curtly, and walked off without another word. After that day, the letters stopped. No more notices. No more veiled threats about non-conformity. Whether it was resignation or quiet respect, I never knew for sure. But something shifted in the neighborhood. A few weeks later, a young couple down the street began building their own retaining wall. Smaller, more modern but clearly inspired by mine. Then, another neighbor hired a landscape designer to rework their entire backyard, citing new design standards in the community. I even caught wind of someone planning to put in a koi pond with a perimeter barrier made of stacked stone. It was like someone had cracked open a door, and now the ideas were flowing in. People weren't just following the rules, they were redefining what living beautifully in the neighborhood could look like. For the first time, the community felt less like a grid of identically painted boxes and more like a place where creativity could breathe. One evening, as I watered the lavender along the base of the wall, Paul, the jogger who'd stopped by before, waved from the sidewalk. "You realize you might be a legend now, right?" he called out. I laughed. "I'm just a guy who read the city code." "Well, legend or not," he said, stepping closer. "You reminded everyone here that we don't have to settle for boring. We can have structure and style. You raised the bar." That stuck with me. I'd never set out to make a statement, not intentionally. I just wanted a solution for my dog. But somewhere along the way, it had turned into something more. A quiet rebellion against unnecessary control, a show of strength through design, and a reminder that rules are only as strong as the people who question them. A month after that, I got a letter in the mail. This time, not from the HOA, but from the city. It was a commendation. Apparently, someone had submitted my project for a local urban design feature. The city wanted to include my retaining wall as a model example of creative landscaping in residential zoning. They praised the functionality, the attention to detail, and the integration of natural aesthetics with urban infrastructure. I laughed when I read it. Max barked at the envelope. It was perfect. I framed the letter and hung it in my office, right next to a photo I'd taken of the wall the day it was finished. Every time I saw it, I remembered the headache, the frustration, the hours spent flipping through city documents and zoning codes. And I remembered that feeling of triumph when the permit came through, when the first stone was laid, and when Max ran across his new yard like it was a meadow made just for him. Some people fight battles with loud voices and angry emails. I fought, mine with concrete and stone, and won. So if you ever find yourself up against an HOA or a rigid system that tells you no just because it can, remember this: you don't have to break the rules to win. You just have to understand them better than they do. They said I couldn't build a fence, so I built a wall, and they never saw it coming.